Hi, I'm Jennifer Keller from the Westport Library, and I'm excited to introduce you to Heather Clark, the author of the new biography of Sylvia Plath entitled Red Comet, and Westport's favorite book reviewer, Sybil Steinberg. Before I get into the introduction, please note that questions can be posed in the Ask a Question tab below. And if you'd like to purchase a book plate copy of Red Comet, you'll see a tab below us that links you to the purchasing page that will be up through this evening. Books will be available for pickup at the Westport Library about a week after the event, and you will receive an email letting you know when they're ready. So, with that housekeeping out of the way, let's get started. Heather Clark earned degrees at Harvard and Oxford universities. She has won a National Endowment for the Humanities Public Scholar Fellowship, a Leon Levy Biography Fellowship at the City University of New York, and a visiting U.S. Fellowship at the Eccles Center for American Studies through the British Library. Her work has appeared in publications including the Harvard Review and the Times Literary Supplement, and she recently served as the scholarly consultant for the BBC documentary Sylvia Plath, Life Inside the Bell Jar. She is currently Professor of Contemporary Poetry at the University of Huddersfield. Since its publication just a few weeks ago, Red Comet has accumulated much praise. The Guardian just today listed it as one of the best books of 2020. It landed on LitHub's Best Books of 2020, and according to LitHub Bookmark, it is one of the top 5 best reviewed biographies of this year. This book also made the best books list at Oprah Magazine and Barnes & Noble just a few weeks ago. And of course, the most important list is it was on Sybil's list, which can now be found on the Westport Library's YouTube page. So if you haven't seen that, go check it out. As many of you know, Westport Sybil Steinberg is a scion of the book reviewing industry. She is currently a contributing editor and former book review section editor for Publishers Weekly, and she is the reading advisor for many of us in this community. So welcome to you both, and without further ado, I'm taking myself off screen.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Jennifer, and hello to Heather.
Hello.
I've interviewed quite a few writers in my time. I've always because I've enjoyed their books. But this is the first time I've ever been able to express gratitude to a writer for having written the book she has written. This biography had to be written. It is the most comprehensive studies of Sylvia Plath's life and her work. And most previous biographies have treated Sylvia Plath's life as sort of a mad dash to death, to early death. This biography has been written in a different spirit with amazing research and an understanding of Sylvia Plath's life that no one has written about before. And believe it or not, it's a pretty hefty book. It's a page turner. Once you start, you don't want to put it down. And in addition, it is a sort of a snapshot of the cultural and social and literary lives in England and America during the 50s and 60s. So, Heather, of course, the obvious question: what brought you to this book? Yeah. Why did you decide to write?
Well, thank you, Sybil, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to the Westport Library for having me. I don't live too far away. I live in Chappaqua, so about 40 minutes down the road. Sybil, like you, I just became sort of frustrated with a lot of the books about Plath out there. And you put it very well when you said it's a sort of mad dash to her death. And some of them, I did feel that she had been overly pathologized in certain biographies, even in movies and newspaper articles, and and that her name had just almost become synonymous with madness and tragedy, and that she had been reduced almost to a cliche, and that her creative legacy had been diminished in the process. And I guess I felt it was unjust, because I think Plath is one of the most innovative and influential poets of the 20th century. And so I it was one of those moments where I just thought, well, I was looking around for a third book project, and I thought, well, maybe I should try this, because I had written a second book on Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. My second book was about their mutual poetic relationship, this idea of influence and how it worked in their creative marriage. So I felt like I had the critical foundation to attack a biography, which, is very intimidating, obviously, writing a biography of a poetic icon. But, but having already finished a book about Plath and Hughes, I felt like, okay, I know where the archives are. I have relationships with the archivists, and I sort of tried to talk myself out of it many times. But and I had taught classes on Sylvia Plath, and so I just decided to take a leap of faith and go for it. My PhD advisor was somebody who was a scholar and a biographer, John Stallworthy, at Oxford, and he was a real mentor to me and role model. And I thought about his work and how he had managed to write these wonderful biographies, but also, really, really great scholarship too. So he was an example of someone who could do both. I think a lot of times in literary studies, it's hard to write a more popular book. You kind of have to pay your dues beforehand with academic books. But he was someone who did both, and I was kind of inspired by his example. So I tried. I did my best.
You did very well. But I'm impressed by your research. Now, there's a lot of new archival material that you were able to tap. Talk about that. Quite a few things like medical records and things like that, and for journals, of course. Ted Hughes burned the journal, the last journal in Sylvia Plath's life, but there were other things that you were able to find that other biographers had not found.
Yeah, I think the main new cache of papers comes from the Rosenstein collection at Emory University. So Harriet Rosenstein was a researcher who started a Plath biography in the 1970s, and she interviewed scores of people who knew Sylvia Plath really well in 1970, 71, 72. So not that long after Plath's death. And she also interviewed Plath's psychiatrist, Dr. Ruth Boischer. Boischer gave her very lengthy and in-depth interviews, and Aurelia Plath, Sylvia Plath's mother. To make a long story short, this collection was in Harriet Rosenstein's possession since the 70s, and she recently sold it to Smith College. Emory University. There was a lawsuit involved with Smith College that was on my mind. That's a different story, but with this collection. But she sold it to Emory University, and it was a treasure trove. I mean, going into that collection and opening, seeing these files, hearing the voices of some of Plath's closest friends from decades back, and also people that had passed away, in the intervening years. And so it was really just incredible to hear their voices through the archive, over that tunnel of time. And also Ruth Boischer, her kind of memories of Plath and that sort of thing. Plath's the Dr. Horder, who treated her at the end of her life. Rosenstein had interviewed him as well. So there were pieces of the puzzle that kind of started to fit a bit more. So a lot of the new materials from that collection. But there were also unpublished letters in that collection, including one Sylvia Plath wrote in I think it was about the last week of her life, that no one had known about. And so that was an incredible collection. And of course, Plath's surviving letters were all published in 2018 in volumes 1 and 2, edited by Peter Steinberg and Karen Kukiel, meticulously edited. So that made my job a lot easier. And part of the reason I decided to take this on was because I knew that the letters were going to be published in 2018. So I knew things were in the pipeline, right? And even though I had already gone to the archives and researched all the letters, it still makes your job a lot easier as a biographer when you can look in an index or this sort of thing. I did interview some people who had not, their voices hadn't really been a part of the story before, things like that. So there is a lot of new information in it. But I should also say, I used quite a few documents that have been in Plath's archives for 40 or 50 years now, but it's just that they didn't really get much attention before. Things like her adolescent unpublished diaries, they're all at the Lilly Library. And they've been underutilized, I think. And her calendars, they provide a very intimate day-to-day story about her life in a way that sometimes the journals don't, because the journals are very kind of philosophical. Whereas for these desk calendars that she wrote on, you can really get almost a very documentary grounding in what she was doing on a daily basis. And then, oh my God, just so many unpublished manuscripts in the archives. Just a ton of unpublished Plath poetry and short stories. And I believe that's being put into a new collection shortly. That's being worked on. But yeah, so a lot of things that have just been in the archives for ages, but because I had the time and the space to include them in this long book over a number of years, I was able to give things more attention than previous biographers who might have been under a tighter deadline, right? So I was just very lucky that my editor at Knopf, Deb Garrison, gave me the time and the space to write an in-depth critical biography, because one didn't exist, and I just felt like she's a major American writer. She needs the 3-inch biography. I hope that doesn't sound too trite, but that was kind of in the back of my mind. And the other thing that was always in the back of my mind was the Hermione Lee quote in the first chapter, that I quote about. She has this. She wrote this sentence in her short introduction to biography, published by Oxford University Press, and she says that often women writers who experience self-harm, mental illness, depression, suicide are often treated as victims or psychological case histories first and professional writers second. And that really inspired me. That sort of lit the fire, that idea that I really wanted to try to treat her as a professional writer first.
Yes, indeed. Well, some of the new research has to do with her family. Her father's death when she was 8, obviously, is a pivotal event in anyone's life, and for would-be poet who was, as you know, in her last poems. But I'm really impressed by the research you've done on both sides of the family, including a grandmother who Sylvia never knew about, who was severely depressed. But it was her father's death. Why don't you talk a little bit about that and how that plunged the family into a whole different sphere of their lives?
Yeah. So Otto Plath died when she was quite young, when she was 8, and that it was traumatic for her in the sense that it's traumatic for any child to lose a parent, but it was also financially catastrophic for the family as well, because he was the breadwinner, and Aurelia went after his death. The family moved from Winthrop to Wellesley, and Sylvia's grandparents moved in with with her in Wellesley to help help with costs, right? And Aurelia went to work, and money was always an issue for Plath and the family. Some of her friends that I interviewed, I was really shocked. They described the family as poor. They actually used the word poor. A few people, and I don't think that was quite true, but there was the sense that women didn't necessarily go to work at that time in the 1940s, right? And one friend said, well, it was just very clear that either Aurelia went to work or the family starved. That was it. So so financially, it was quite difficult. And of course, she wrote a lot of poetry about her father. I think it's obvious that she missed him always. And she started writing poems about him at Smith College. She started writing elegies, and she wrote several elegies over the course of her life for him, kind of culminating in one of her most famous poems, Daddy. And so he was always this muse figure in a way for her. But so a lot has been written about Plath and her father, and I felt like more needed to be written about her relationship with her mother. I was so fascinated by that relationship, and so that's a big theme in the book is this mother-daughter tension. But I think Otto's example as someone who got his doctorate from Harvard, he was a professor at BU, he was a kind of great man, right? That was always, I think, in the back of her mind too, as this model of success and achievement that she maybe had to live up to. And by the way, speaking of Otto, there were lots of great anecdotes and the new material in the Rosenstein files that I was just talking about. There were letters from men who had lived with Otto when he was a student at Harvard. So that was, again, he had been a sort of black hole for me. And so reading all of these recollections from his old friends, these letters, I saw a human side of him. So that I tried to put that in the book to kind of give him a bit more color.
I understood for the first time how heroic Aurelia Plath really was, Sylvia's mother, and how she had to skimp and count every penny. And what was interesting was that Sylvia could have gone to Wellesley College as a townie, and it wouldn't have cost the family much money, but she wanted to go to Smith. And you have written about what Aurelia had to do, even though Sylvia had a scholarship, of course, the money that had to be watched, every penny of it. And Sylvia herself figuring out, could she afford to take the train to Yale for the weekend or whatever. And this is the first time I have really seen this demonstrated by research. It was fascinating. So I knew Sylvia at Smith, and I do have something to say about her relationship with her mother. But first of all, we met at start of junior year. We were both taking honors in English, and the one requisite was a course of medieval literature with Professor Patch. So you know about Professor Patch.
Yeah.
Well, he was an ogre. A brilliant man, wonderful teacher, but he made students cry at least once or twice through every session. He was a big man. Sylvia, in her letters, calls him gigantic. He was 6'5", but he was psychologically big. He filled the room or whatever. And, of course, we were all frightened of him. So Sylvia says in her letters, it's in the first volume, I'll be lucky if I get a low B in the course because the other 7 girls in the class are all the most brilliant girls in the college. No. Sylvia, of course, needed the A to keep her scholarship, which the rest of us did not understand. And of course, Sylvia got the only straight A that Mr. Patch bestowed during that seminar. But we were all terrified of him. And after the first session, Sylvia came up to me and said she liked my name and would I agree to meet her at the corner of the campus every week and walk to the seminar, which is in Professor Plath's house. I said, sure. And she said she was too nervous to go on her own. And because Sylvia made the rules were that we would not talk about what we were preparing for the session, what paper we had written. So what do girls in the 50s talked about the boys we had dated the previous weekend. And Sylvia, as you know, was very busy. So, but what struck me, what we're getting to here, was that every time she talked about going away for the previous weekend, she expressed guilt that she had not gone home to see her mother. This was so strange to me that I remembered it. I knew it was strange.
Yeah.
And so that's, that was truly the beginning. She loved her mother. Her mother sacrificed everything for her, but there was just that bit of resentment that was always there. And at any rate, I was very glad to have known her. I corresponded with her after the first suicide attempt, but we're not getting there yet. I want to go back to what we were talking about. Her years at Smith, and now please talk about her time at Mademoiselle magazine when she won the editorship.
Yeah. Well, I love that she told you she liked your name, the sound of your name, Sybil Steinberg. Sybil, yeah, like the
but she liked my first name.
Yeah.
And she was initiating.
Yeah.
I mean, to be with her.
Yeah.
So
wow. Yeah. So Mademoiselle, it was one of the most prestigious internships that a young literary woman could get at the time, and it was fiercely competitive. And she had been gunning for it for the past year. It was actually a pretty complicated process to win one of these. Very competitive. That's the impression I got. Yeah, with all kinds of assignments, leading into. Yeah. So it. But she won an internship. She earned her place, and I think she wanted to. I think she wished that she had been able to meet more writers, right? Like she really wanted to meet Dylan Thomas, and I think she maybe went into it thinking it would be a more literary experience. And of course she was an intern, so I think she still had a lot of responsibility, but I think she felt a lot of pressure, and it was hard to handle. She had some bad experiences in New York, potential sexual assault on a bad date that's immortalized in the bell jar, and so I just think it was a lot. She had never really left Massachusetts before. She'd never even stayed in a hotel before. She stayed at the Barbizon in New York, so it was just a lot for her to take on, and she fell into a depression. And it was when she came home at the end of that month of June 1953, her mother told her that she hadn't gotten into Frank O'Connor's writing class at Harvard Summer School. And this sort of triggered, an even kind of she devolved after that point where she heard that news. But she was already not in a great state coming back. So
she was occupied, obsessed by the Rosenberg trial, also about a lot of talk about possible nuclear warfare, and she was a very sensitive person, certainly.
Yeah, she was really upset by the Rosenberg trial and felt that it was unfair, and felt that the people around her were they were indifferent, or even happy that the Rosenbergs were going to be put to death. And she was very aware of kind of these McCarthyist tendencies, and so that disturbed her, being around people who weren't bothered by that disturbed her. And also I think just being immersed in the world of fashion 24 hours a day, where, you know, women were always objectified and made objects, you know, and she wanted to be the subject. So I think there was, you know, I think that was tough too. In the bell jar, she writes, Esther thinks so. Fashion writing, the words came to me with a hollow pop, and she kind of suggests that fashion writing is superficial, as Esther does in the bell jar. So I think, yeah, there was a lot. I mean, it would be more fashion than she had bargained for, and less literature.
Materialism, really.
Yeah.
It's true. So she did make an attempt at suicide. Some people who don't know anything else may remember that. And she was discovered in her mother's basement just in time. And this is the hard part to swallow. At the point where she needed good psychiatric attention, Sylvia was first at a local psychiatric institution, and then McLean. I did not know until I read it in the book that McLean had begun to lose its luster as a preeminent psychiatric institution, and that's where she suffered the electric shock treatment, and that was barbaric, and you can say it better than I. Please explain what happened.
Yeah, it was the mid-50s, right? And ECT had only really been in practice for about 15 years. And the medical history that I read of McLean, I remember the author said that the psychiatrists at McLean were actually reluctant to practice ECT on any members of staff, any fellow doctors, which I thought was quite revelatory. So, obviously ECT can work wonders now, right? But at the time, this was explained to me by psychiatrists that I interviewed and my own research on medical history. It wasn't as well regulated and understood. And there was a particular asylum called Valley Head in Carlisle, Massachusetts, where she went to first for outpatient shock therapy sessions. And it seems like, judging from the letters and from what I've heard, again, interviewing older psychiatrists who remembered that hospital, that she had a very bad experience there. She wasn't given any anesthesia. It was just the treatment was not well administered. And she was completely traumatized by her treatment there. And she wrote about the trauma that she felt in letters to others. So this isn't just me speculating, there are really, really moving letters from her about her shock treatment and just what a nightmare it was, how harrowing at Valley Head, at that first hospital. And then when she was admitted into McLean, she was terrified of having more shock treatment. And unfortunately, she did end up having more treatments, but she refused after 6 treatments. She said, no more, I'm done. Apparently these treatments were done with they were better regulated than the ones at Valley Head. They didn't cause quite as much trauma. And she did seem to recover after McLean. So that's where she had her female psychiatrist, Dr. Ruth Boischer, who she confided in. But I think that terror of shock treatment was always in the back of her mind. It always stayed with her, and I think it was at the end of her life. The prospect of that was quite terrifying.
Well, yes,
so.
That's one of the fascinating insights that you make. But she did recover. She came back to Smith. She was able to graduate the following year, and she won the Fulbright to Cambridge, which she really, really wanted and was thrilled about. And at this point, as you bring out so well, she knew that she needed to write and publish and be known. But on the other hand, this was the time that she started thinking about the fact that while she wanted marriage and children, she was so afraid that that would impede the flowering of her literary career. And this is a dichotomy that lasts the rest of her life.
Yeah.
So, but
Yes.
it's so much interesting material that you present about how Sylvia was looked down upon originally when she wanted to mix with the literary crew at the college, how she was mocked by being an American. Well, please go ahead. There's so much more you want to say about that.
Yeah. I mean, I think in women still today, this resonated with me, this struggle to kind of, on the one hand, pursue a literary life, and on the other, have children and a family. She had to deal with that dichotomy at a very different time from today. But as I say, it hasn't ended. I think it's still a struggle. But she didn't like being told that she had to choose. She didn't like being told, okay, you can either have a family or you can become a great writer. She wanted it all, right? This was sort of a part of her, what I think of as Sylvia Plath's feminism, even though she died before second wave feminism became mainstream. I think that sense that she had to choose, it angered her, and she felt the double standard of that. So when she went to Cambridge, she was trying to get published in all the Cambridge literary magazines. She was going to parties, trying to meet the hot poets, not hot physically, but the most successful college poets, although, anyway. So she was, as one of her Cambridge contemporaries told me, she was really doing her homework, right? She was sussing out the scene and trying to kind of ingratiate herself into that scene and become a respected Cambridge poet. But it was really tough. I mean, Cambridge was not Smith, right? Smith was a more nurturing, as you know, right? All women's college. At Cambridge, she was a second-class citizen because women were in the minority. There weren't that many women's colleges at Cambridge, and the women's colleges were much less wealthy than the men's colleges. So this was a shock to her when she got to Cambridge, and she felt that kind of everyday misogyny, or she felt that keenly. But so the poetry that she was publishing in the literary magazines at Cambridge, I think she was already starting from a disadvantage because she was a woman. But she was also writing in a kind of vein that Ted Hughes and his friends did. They mocked what they felt was kind of a too genteel approach to poetry, too decorous, too well-mannered, too well-made, and they were out to smash it all up and create their kind of create it all from the ground up again. So she was publicly mocked in a particular Cambridge magazine, and that was very humiliating for her. But she still, she was such a fighter. She even after she was mocked in this Cambridge literary magazine for this poem she wrote, and she still wanted to meet these guys. She wanted to prove herself. That's one thing I learned about Sylvia Plath over the course of this book, just how strong she was, what an iron will she had to pursue her literary vocation, to become this great writer. And despite all the barriers in her way as a woman in the 1950s, I just have so much respect for what she was able to achieve. But so yeah, she and she did. She made herself known at Cambridge. She met Ted Hughes famously at a party for the launch of a new literary magazine. He kissed her. She bit his cheek. This is sort of the maybe the most famous date in literary history, the most famous first date.
Everybody knows about that, whether they've read her poetry or not, right?
Yeah, everyone. That's the first thing people know about Sylvia Plath. Yeah.
Right. But it it was a wonderful, when it started, a wonderful creative partnership. He was the man that she had dreamed of, an equal partner, equally creative, except that, as you have brought out, she felt herself secondary to him. He was a man and he was a poet.
Yeah.
And it took quite a while, several years, for her to understand that she could compete on the same level. So, but as you say, it was, they got married. She came back to Smith. She taught for a year, and then I don't remember having read in other books about then they were in Boston. She and Ted. He hated America. Right?
Yeah, he really.
And but they were part of the scene in Cambridge.
Yeah.
The poets. Yes. That Elizabeth Hardwick and Robert Lowell came to dinner.
Yeah.
And yes, and she met Robert Frost, but in each case as an auxiliary, not as a poet herself.
Yeah, yeah, and there are, I think Stanley Kunitz said she was always on Ted's arm, or that sort of thing.
Yeah. So when they decided to go back to England because Ted's book collection, Locale, was going to be published there, she was 5 months pregnant. This really got me, the bravery of this woman.
Oh, I know.
Pregnant, they were going back to what was really an alien country, she discovered, especially in Yorkshire with Ted's family. They didn't have any money.
Yeah.
So it was so tough, even finding a place to live. Yeah. And her strength, her determination in doing that is just amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's another example of just the fighting spirit, This is someone who just never quit, and obviously when she suffered from depression, everything changed, but in her sort of day-to-day, life, she was a fighter. Absolutely.
Oh my gosh. Well, so in a short space of time, she discovered that her first book that she got to see, the collection Colossus, had a publisher, and she had Frida, baby, and Ted's book was published, and it was beautiful.
Yeah.
But she was tired.
It was tiring, yes.
She was tired. And then they bought the cottage in Devon, which was her dream. Mm-hmm. She had the second child, Nicholas. Mm-hmm. They tried to give each other their own time to write. I'm speeding through a lot of information here. Ted was not happy. He was restless.
Yeah, he was restless. Yeah. And she had 2 kids, two small kids, 2 very small kids. She had her hands full.
She really did. And I guess the hardest part was because she had been so idealistic about how this would work out. Yeah. And, and I'm perhaps going too fast to explain how important it was for each of them. They influenced each other's creative sphere, arc. Yes.
Yeah. So I think so. Yeah. That's what my second book is about. So I absolutely agree with you.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So here we go. Ted left. Went to London. There she was out in the country with 2 little kids until she finally decided that she should go to London herself and found a flat. It looked heaven sent. It was, the plaque on the house said that Yeats had lived there. So there she was in the coldest winter in England in half a century or something like that.
Yeah.
And the kids were sick, and she had her usual sinus problems. Now just Go ahead with it, Heather. Talk about first what she wrote the bell jar to
Yes.
to make money.
Yeah, I mean, she had written the bell jar very quickly, actually, and it was in just a matter of months, and it was published in January of 1963 in London. Now, by this time, as you say, she had left Devon. She hadn't sold Court Green, but she was living in Yates's flat with the two children without Ted. She was on her own, and she was really hopeful about her new life at this time. She wanted to be an independent woman. She wanted to make her own money, write books, support her children. She had this wonderful plan to rent out her house in Devon to American tourists, and then she would go to Devon sometimes and rent out her flat in London to American tourists. She had a really great business sense, actually. It comes through a lot in her letters. So she had these fantastic plans, and then the bell jar came out. The reviews, I thought, were pretty good, actually, but Ted Hughes in some of his poems said they weren't quite enough. He remembered her being a bit upset about some of the more lukewarm reviews, because this was supposed to be the bestseller, right? This was the book that was supposed to give her the financial independence that she wanted. Now, Ted was still giving her money, but yeah, things were complicated financially, and I think, the winter, she was lonely, she was tired, she was taking care of two babies, she was sick. That's something that we often forget. She was sick. She was suffering from a respiratory illness at this time, and she'd been x-rayed for pneumonia. I mean, everything, it was the perfect storm, right? And another relationship with a London critic hadn't quite worked out the way she thought it might have, and so she was feeling rejection, she was feeling loneliness, and she didn't have the help she needed in terms of a nanny or an au pair. That's one of the most frequent motifs in her final letters. It's like, I need a nanny, I need help, and that that was really hard for her, because she didn't have the time to write that she was used to, and if she wasn't writing, that wasn't a good state for her. She would wake up at 4 a.m. before the babies woke to write, because that was sort of all the time that she had. And she was also on these drugs, these antidepressants that she had been prescribed, and she was on medicine. She was taking medicine for her respiratory infection. And I make the point in the book that we at least have to take into account the possibility that some of these the interactions of some of these drugs may have made her condition even worse. A lot of people, they talk about how she was slurring her words at the end of her life. She was sort of lapsing back into an American accent and just acting in ways that she normally didn't. That she just, and so yeah, that it was. I mean, who knows really at the end of the day, but I have. She what? Sorry.
She wrote the poem.
She wrote the poems, yeah. And in the fall of 1962, she wrote most of the poems of Ariel, and she wrote a lot of them when she was still in Devon. I think a lot of the rage that she felt toward Hughes, she rode that creative wave. She rode those waves of fury in this sort of aesthetically triumphant way. But then, there was the crash later. And a lot of the poems that she wrote in January and February of 1963 are the opposite of the more exuberant Ariel poems. And they're much more still and sort of flat. They're beautiful poems, but they're not, they don't have the lift, right, that a poem like Lady Lazarus does. I'm thinking of poems like Sheep and Fog and Words and Edge, these poems she wrote some of the last poems she ever wrote. So the aesthetic really changes, and I think those are some of the most profound poems about depression in the English language. Poems like The Moon and the Yew Tree, Sheep and Fog, Words, Elm, Edge. It just, yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Marvelous. And it's just, so it's almost, it is amazing. It's it almost too big to understand that there she was in the full flowering of her genius was in the last few weeks of her life. And it just, and so of course she never saw Ariel. It was published
right
after she died. And something else I discovered in your book was that she was seeing a doctor who was very sympathetic, a good doctor, but not a psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm.
And he recommended that on the Monday of that weekend, she would go to a psychiatric institute and be treated. And you suggest, it makes very good sense, all of the memories of the electric shock treatment, which she had no idea she thought might be administered again. When she was writing the book Bell Jar, that all came to the surface.
Yeah.
And so when it could very well have been that just her fear of having to go to that hospital on the following day might have been the reason that she gave up.
I definitely, I wanted to at least broach that possibility. I mean, who really knows in the end? But it seemed that given the sense of trauma that she had experienced, and also given her last letter that she wrote to her psychiatrist, which was written on February 4th, a few days before her suicide, she specifically talked about her fear of, quote, mental hospitals and lobotomies. And so I think, maybe that played a part. And she knew that she wouldn't be going to McLean in a limousine, which is what had happened before. Her benefactress, Olive Higgins Prouty, had paid for her to go to McLean, which was, quite a posh mental hospital. This was not going to happen again. She feared that she would end up in what she called a Dickensian hospital, and she had, she didn't have the money to pay for a fancy place, even though the hospital that Horter was thinking about, was trying to get her into, was actually quite good. But I think, again, I at least wanted to bring up the possibility, right, that there was this trauma from her earlier experiences, and she didn't. That was, I think, terrifying.
Indeed. And then the other sad thing, which she didn't live to know about, was that Ted Hughes and his sister, who had expressed disdain and dislike for Sylvia, were in charge of her estate.
Yeah. I mean, that was, to be totally frank, I don't think I would have tried to write this biography if Olwen Hughes had still been in charge of the Plath estate. So things are different now. Memories are less raw. A lot of time has passed. But yeah, I mean, they both hated biographers. Ted Hughes hated biographers too. So I actually quote him in the book. He talks about his antipathy for biographers, and how can they ever think that they know the truth? So yeah, I would not have attempted if that had been the case. And I have some sympathy for people like Anne Stevenson, who wrote Bitter Fame, and it was basically that was a Sylvia Plath biography that came out in 1989, and it was co-authored by Olwen. And I've read through all the correspondence at Smith about that biography. That was sort of one of the rabbit holes that I went down, and none of it ended up in the book. But reading Olwen's and Anne Stevenson's correspondence, it doesn't make for easy reading. So I knew that story, and I would not have wanted to go through anything like that myself.
Well, some of us have been in a rage ever since we read that book. So this was wonderful. I've had a wonderful time talking to you. I wonder, is there a question I haven't asked that you would like to talk about?
I guess, well, maybe a little plug for my next book, which is, you mentioned Boston and the Boston poetry scene. And that was such a rich period, and I learned so much more about it while I was writing the biography, that I decided that I was going to write my next book about poetry in Boston in the 50s and focus on Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, Adrienne Rich, and Maxine Kumin, who all sort of knew each other in the 50s, 60s, 70s, some better than others, but they were all kind of in the same orbit. And Plath learned a lot from Robert Lowell. She took Robert Lowell's poetry class, and Anne Sexton was in that class as well. So I think that was a huge influence on her writing. Just hearing Robert Lowell read his poems in 1959, he read poems from Life Studies out loud in that class. And these poems really faced taboo, right? He wrote about depression and suicide and mental hospitals and this kind. And I feel like Lowell almost gave her permission to address some of those subjects in her own work, which she really hadn't before. And also her lines loosened up a lot after the Lowell seminar. So that's such a fascinating topic, and I can't wait to get into that more in my next book. Well, it will be much shorter, by the way. It's going to be 300 pages max.
It just was fascinating. Is there anything you want to say about, just as a last word before the questions from the audience, about Sylvia Plath's impact, her place in the pantheon of American poetry? I think too often she is overlooked. The Ariel was published in England first.
Yeah.
And in fact, the Bell Jar was turned down here and not even published here. I would like to hear from you your impression of really what it is about that poetry, that last collection, which is totally astonishing.
I have such a hard time putting it into words. So much of it is almost this physical response to it. I think it's as I was saying before, the words they almost take flight. She uses these short lines and dashes and exclamation points, and there's a viscerality to them and an exuberance, and yet even these poems that are propelled by an almost centrifugal velocity, like Lady Lazarus or Ariel, she still manages to keep regular poetic. She plays by the rules still a bit, right? The stanzas are all the same number of lines in a lot of these poems, and there's still a lot of rhyme. She uses rhyme in such innovative ways, and she uses surrealism as well, which I think is another thing we overlook quite a bit when we talk about Sylvia Plath. She's often called a confessional poet, right? And I sort of make the argument in this book that, yeah, she was, but I do feel like that label is, it shortchanges her a bit. It puts her into this box. And because she was someone who used a lot of surrealism. She was so inspired by surrealist art, a lot of myth, classical myth. And she gives part of her life in these poems. And yes, they are slightly autobiographical, but they're buttressed by myth, by almost this abstract expressionism, right, in her poems. And you never really get the truth. These poems are quite ironic. A lot of the poems that have been called confessional, and again, I'm thinking of Lady Lazarus. She takes that confessional label and she just does something. She plays with it, and I think her poems are just a lot more ironic than we give her credit for. She's playing with that confessional label, and okay, I'll tell the truth, but I'll tell it slant, like Emily Dickinson. And I think so. A lot of the poem's power, actually, I think, comes from the musicality and the assonance and the sibilance that she uses, and but also the innovation of this sort of new tone, these really short lines, and I think, she was a poet's poet. She was she had served such a poetic apprenticeship. I think sometimes people read a poem like Daddy that seems very simplistic and don't quite realize all the heavy lifting that went into that poem, where she's actually breaking with tradition and making it new. And so, yeah, the innovation and
Well, thank you so much. We'll open now, I guess, to questions and ask. There's Jennifer. Very good. Thank you, Heather Clark. This has been
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sybil.
Thank you both. We do have some questions from the audience. So with your permissions, I'm going to stretch this program out just a little bit longer than our 1 hour. All righty. So I'm going to start with the very first one that came in, because Sherry starts off by saying this was her favorite book of the year. So
oh my goodness, thank you.
She's wondering if you were able to talk to Frida about any of her memories.
I did not talk to. I sent Frida the manuscript. I sent her the full manuscript before it was published, and hoping she liked it. Really, I mean, hoping that. Well, she liked, that's sort of the wrong phrase to use, but I really care about how living family members feel about my work. I'm very kind of aware and attuned to that as well, and what they've been through. I mean, and Carol Hughes as well. So I sent them both the manuscript. I didn't try to interview either one of them, but I did send them the manuscript and asked. And they both asked for some very minor changes, which I made. But yeah. But Frida's we have a correspondence, but she just seems like a really incredible and tough, brave person.
So our next question comes from Michelle, and she wanted to know why Ted Hughes destroyed that last journal.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's sort of a conspiracy theory, I guess. He told a literary critic at one point that he actually hadn't destroyed it. So who knows? He said publicly that he wanted to spare Plath's children the end of that journal, and he never wanted them to read what she wrote. So, but he did say to a literary critic, well, actually, I didn't burn it. So there's a lot of speculation that it might still exist, and also her novel, her lost novel. There's a lot of speculation about that too. This is why there will be new material will come to light someday, and there will be more biographies, and this is just, my book is part of a continuing dialogue about Anglo-American poetry and Sylvia Plath, and because there's a lot of stuff out there still, I think.
Okay, so Eileen would like to know what influenced her in her childhood to make her believe that a woman in that era could become a writer, as for a living.
Yeah, such a good question. I think I spent quite a bit of time in the early part of the book going over Plath's juvenilia, and I quote poems she wrote when she was 8 and 9 and 10, and I try to make the point that she had this almost perfect ear. She understood. She could write in iambic trimeter, when she was 9 years old. She had a perfect sense of meter from a very early age, and she was almost a prodigy. So it's a really good question, to the extent that where did it come from? This drive, right? Where did it come from? I think she read poetry, and she wrote in an essay that she heard Matthew Arnold's The Forsaken Merman, and that was her first literary frisson. She said she felt this physical feeling. It was like a ghost had passed over her body, and she was hooked. And her mother read her a lot of poetry as a toddler. Her mother was extremely literary. Her mother actually had wanted to become a writer herself. Extremely smart, ambitious, literary woman, Aurelia Plath. So she read them Yeats, she read them Browning, she read them Robert Frost, she read 19th century poems, the Romantics. So I think she just, when she heard it, she wanted to do more of it. It came from within. And that's another thing I mentioned in the book, this idea that she only wrote to get love, or she only wrote to please her parents. Maybe there's some truth to that, but I try to make the argument that this was actually a calling. This was a real calling, and her whole life she struggled to fulfill that creative aesthetic calling that she felt, and that just it drove her. And I think we need to honor that calling and not kind of diminish it. So yeah, she wanted to be she wanted to be a poetess from the time she was 8 years old.
Well, that's knowing what you want to do.
Yeah.
Jessica thanks you for this riveting book, and she's wondering what surprised most during your delve into the archives.
What surprised me most, probably the letters from Dr. Horder to Harriet Rosenstein at the very end, that described some of his treatments at the very end of Plath's life. Because again, it was like filling in some of these last remaining pieces of the puzzle, and knowing the name of the hospital that he was trying to get her into, and how far that plan had actually progressed, and just hearing in his own voice, and then the name of the antidepressant that he had her on. So there was a real specificity there in those letters to her that I hadn't seen before. So, and that kind of dovetailed with what I had been thinking anyway, about her last letter, about her fear of mental hospitals and lobotomies, and this kind of terror she felt at losing her free will. And again, this is 1963. It's not an easy time to be a patient in a mental hospital. And she really had these terrifying visions of kind of just being locked away and losing her lucidity. So that, I think that file was probably maybe not the most surprising, but the one that I felt like it all kind of made sense when I read that.
Great. Could you speak about why you chose Red Comet as the title for this biography?
Yes. Well, there's a there's a backstory behind this title. So for 8 years or so, or 7 years, the title was actually The Light of the Mind. And then, so my editor and the team at Knopf didn't think that was a great title, to be honest. They very politely told me, we got to change the title. I really loved that title because it was one of my favorite lines from Sylvia Plath's The Moon and the Yew Tree. The first line is, "This is the light of the mind, cold and planetary." And again, it's one of those lines that it gives you goosebumps, and you don't even understand why, but that kind of mindscape that she describes of depression. And so, long story short, we went back and forth about some titles, and the decision, we kind of collaboratively, I have to give credit to my editor, actually. She suggested it, to take that from Stings. That it's right in the beginning of the book. We quote the poem, and so they just sort of thought it was a bolder title, and that this book really shouldn't have a kind of more subtle title. And they're trying to sell a 1,000-page book, so I was happy to change the title and take their advice on that. I'm an academic. I'm used to long titles with colons, and so this is a new world for me.
Well, welcome to this new world. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for shedding light on this remarkable woman and being here with us this evening, both Heather and Sybil. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and I know that our audience has been riveted because I haven't seen the usual number of chats on the side. So this is, they've been riveted. For those of you watching, you can still purchase a book-plated signed copy of Red Comet. The link will be open through this evening, or you can buy it through your other favorite booksellers, or you can also borrow it from the library. And for more information about other events and previous recordings, visit westportlibrary.org. Thank you both for this wonderful conversation this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Sybil, as well. For great questions. I wish I'd interviewed you.
Next time.
Next time, right?
Good, now that we've met. That's
Yep.
wonderful. All right.
Thank